If you've ever felt like you're destined to be rich and successful, you may be right. And I'm not talking about karma or your astrological sign. Dalton Conley, a sociologist, says your genes could hold the roadmap of your entire life. His new book, The Social Genome, explores the century-old debate of nature versus nurture by breaking down the genetic predictions that make up each one of us. It's a relatively new finding that came out of scientists finally being able to sequence the human genome in 2003. In other words, we finally had the ability to read the equivalent of a human instruction manual.
There had been a betting pool to see how many genes humans actually had. After all, like rice had about 100,000 genes. And so I think the lowest bid was somewhere around 90,000 genes. And it turned out that we only have 20,000 genes. Nobody was even close in the betting pool in the Human Genome Project. But still, they thought that once that so-called dictionary of life had been decoded, that it would be a few short years before we knew the 5 genes behind heart disease and the 10 behind schizophrenia and the dozen behind cognitive ability. And then, Big Pharma would get to work on making mimics of those genes or blockers of those genes, as the case may be.
Conley is the Henry Putnam University Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. He says that scientists believe the hardest part was over, and now they'd have a specific instruction manual to make the best, most effective drugs for any need. But as you might have guessed, this hope was nowhere near reality. Instead of a few genes impacting conditions like arthritis or high blood pressure, the researchers realized that these outcomes were controlled by small differences across the entire genome, which consists of around 3 billion base pairs. So in order to find these small differences, scientists scanned the entire genome to see which parts of the DNA have an effect on a single condition, like heart disease.
The effects were so teeny that at first they despaired, but then in 2009, someone realized you can sum all these little effects into a single score, and that's what's called the polygenic score, the polygenic index is the term I use now. And I call that the FICO credit score of human biology. But it really is scores because you have one for height, how to predict how tall you're going to be. In fact, that score can predict your, a baby's adult height, plus or minus an inch pretty well. There's one for how far you're going to go in school. And if you're in the top 10% of the polygenic index distribution for education, you have a 71% likelihood of graduating from college, for 4-year college. And if you're in the bottom 10%, you have a 9% likelihood of graduating from college.
Simply put, the polygenic index, or PGI, is a prediction on how your life will turn out based on your genes. It doesn't mean your fate is set in stone, but it does calculate what the most likely outcome is, from financial success to what type of friends you'll have.
You can predict your BMI, your cholesterol level, your blood pressure, your risk of depression, and so on. If you name an outcome, there's a PGI for it. And since it's using the same ingredient, it's kind of like you walk into your kitchen and you want to make something for dinner. You have the same ingredients there every night. It's just you're adjusting the amount. How much is this gene? Sort of how heavily weighted is this gene for education? Well, a lot. But for height, it's a different gene that's most heavily weighted. And when you add up so they're using the same really 3 million markers across the genome, and they're just giving different weights to those markers and adding up the sum for each outcome.
If this score can truly predict all aspects of life, the next question on everyone's mind is, how accurate is it? The short answer is, it depends. Conley says it's most accurate at predicting height, partially because most of that outcome is genetic and only about 15% is affected by our environment.
It's had the longest history and the biggest sample sizes. So I think it can predict around 60% of the variation. So it doesn't predict the whole 85%. But like I said, that results in being able to predict a baby's height pretty closely. Body mass index, like how heavy or light we are, is I think the next best predictor. And then like education and cognitive ability. Then you go down to like things like personality type, or whether someone's going to suffer from depression or how depressed they are, smoking behavior. Then we get to like more and more noisy predictors where yes, they predict, but they're not adding a lot of information, those polygenic scores. But they're all getting better each year as we get bigger samples to train them on and so forth.
In his book, Conley equates it to a meteorologist. They're not always accurate, but we still tune in to hear their predictions. And as he mentioned, the more data and variations that are collected, the better these predictions get. For example, the PGI is much better at calculating a person's BMI who is born today than someone born closer to the beginning of the 20th century.
If you look back then, most people were thin. Most people didn't have unlimited amount of calories to eat. They lived a more active lifestyle. So we were all thinner on average, and the wide tail of obesity was shrunken. So yes, you still had some obese people, but for the most part, there wasn't a lot of variation to explain, and genetics didn't do a lot of work in explaining it. So the polygenic index for body mass index didn't predict.
But today's world offers countless food options, which has created a wide range of differences in our body composition. As the environment has widened our dietary possibilities, our genes are able to show greater variation person to person and better predict BMI.
It's actually because of our environment now that the BMI PGI predicts better. I'll give you another example that's a little bit different. The smoking. In 1950, almost half of Americans smoked. And then in 1964, the Surgeon General's report was issued on the dangers of smoking. And around that time, we start seeing a steady drop in smoking rates. And today, whoever smokes is kind of hardwired in terms of their nicotine receptors to just be addicted to nicotine. And they're a very sort of core group of smokers who is very difficult for them to quit. And what we see is today, we can predict much better than we could in 1950 by genes who smokes.
Our genes work together with our environment, which means that if something is not normal in society, there's a good chance its PGI score won't be very accurate. For instance, the polygenic index for education always worked well in men, but wasn't accurate for women in the early 20th century when having females in higher education was taboo.
And now today, women make up more than half of college graduates, and we see that the polygenic index for education predicts much better for them. So it's not independent of the environment is the sort of take-home message here. You can't just think of it as something that's deterministic, just wholly operating within our bodies. It's something that interacts with the environment.
Having access to this polygenic index opens the door to research opportunities Conley says couldn't have been done before. Peer studies, for example, are hard to do because there are so many unknown factors. Do two friends smoke because they have the same hobby? Did they become friends because they both smoke? Or did one person influence the other?
It's really hard to disentangle all those different possibilities, but having a polygenic index for smoking means that if my polygenic index for smoking is correlated with your smoking behavior, there's no way that your smoking behavior affected my genes. It's got to go from my genes to your behavior, or from your genes to my behavior. We find that just having a handful of kids who are like at the top end of the distribution are really likely to smoke kind of sets off a wildfire, a social wildfire across the network, and raises the likelihood that everybody's going to smoke in that grade.
Being able to use the PGI as a control helped them realize that the societal norms of the entire grade hold more influence than your closest friend.
Another example is that we know that spouses who are happy both tend to be happy, and we're in couples where there's depression, both tend to be depressed. Like there's a strong correlation between spouses' depression. Well, one question is, do spouses who are prone to be depressed marry each other? They kind of end up together and they're already on their way to being depressed. It's like not about spouses causing each other to be depressed. They just found each other. Or is one causing the other to be depressed? And if so, is it asymmetrical? Like there's an old adage that says, happy wife, happy life, that the idea that the wife or the woman in the household is kind of shapes the emotional climate of the household more than the man does.
It was a nearly impossible question to study until they were able to use the couple's genes to test these theories.
We looked at the polygenic indexes of spouses for depression, and we found that they're not correlated at all. So spouses who are like have low likelihoods of depression or high likelihoods of depression are not sorting on that with each other. They're sorting on a lot of things like height and education, for example, but they're not sorting on their genetic liability for depression.
Then when they looked at how the husband's genes affect the wife's mood and vice versa, they proved that, at least genetically, the old adage is not true. They each affect each other's mood equally, and it's actually quite a large effect.
The effect of your spouse's genes on your depression level is a third as big as your own genes in your own body. So identifying these social genetic effects are kind of that's what we call these indirect effects through someone else, is a really exciting new field, at least in my neck of the woods.
Conley notes that the presence of PGIs didn't just improve his work, but had him questioning aspects of his personal life as well. Join us next week as Conley describes how PGIs have influenced his parenting and finally puts the nature versus nurture debate to rest. Conley's book, The Social Genome, is available now wherever books are sold. You can find more information about Dalton Conley and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zavari. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.